It's early morning. Somewhere around 6. The neighborhood is still dark, and the street outside is empty in that particular way it only gets before the rest of the world remembers it exists. A man is standing at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee that's already gone slightly cold. He's not checking his phone. He's not scrolling. He's just standing there, watching the sky do what it does every morning, shift, slowly, from black to a deep bruised blue. He's 53. Maybe 57. It's hard to tell from a distance because something about him doesn't map neatly onto the usual signals of age. The face has lines, yes. The hair is gray, or gone. But the posture is solid. The eyes are patient. There's something in the way he occupies that kitchen, still, unhurried, completely present, that doesn't read as old. It reads as settled. Maybe that's you. Maybe you recognized something in that image before I finished describing it. The early mornings, the quiet ritual, the sense that the day before it starts is often the best part of it. The sense that you don't need company to feel okay. That silence stopped being uncomfortable sometime in your 40s and became, instead, something close to luxury. That's not a coincidence. That's not just temperament. And it's certainly not what the culture tends to describe when it talks about men aging. The popular narrative about men getting older, the one that's been circulating since the boomers turned 50, is fundamentally a crisis narrative. The midlife collapse. The desperate reinvention. The man who wakes up one day, looks in the mirror, and decides he needs a different life, a faster car, a younger version of everything. That story got told so many times it became a kind of cultural furniture, always there, slightly in the way, assumed to be universal. But here's the thing. That story was never really about GenXMen. Because something genuinely different happened to this generation as it aged. Not universally. Not in every man. But in a specific kind of man, one who was already built for something other than performance, already oriented toward depth over noise, already carrying a particular psychological architecture that only becomes more useful with time. These men didn't hit 50 and fall apart. They hit 50 and arrived. And the reason why? The actual psychological mechanism underneath it, is something most people never get around to examining. Because it doesn't make noise. Because the men it describes don't tend to announce themselves. And because the culture is generally better at documenting collapse than it is at documenting the quiet, slow, unglamorous process of a man coming fully into himself. That's what this is about. Not the crisis. The opposite of the crisis. The particular way that certain Gen X men age. And why the traits that made them hard to read at 30 become, at 50 and 60, something closer to a superpower. To understand what makes this aging pattern different, you have to understand something about the specific psychological material these men were built from. Gen X didn't get a gentle introduction to the world. They grew up in the gap. After the optimism of the post-war decades had worn through, and before the connected, curated, perpetually affirmed experience of growing up online. They landed in the middle. In the divorce statistics, the latchkey afternoons, the cultural messaging that was simultaneously telling them to be sensitive and then punishing them for it. In households where competence was expected and emotional expression was, at best, a private matter. What that produced, in the men who came through it intact, was a very specific psychological profile. Not damaged. Not hardened in the brittle sense. But tempered. Like metal that has been through a process that removes the weak points without removing the flexibility. These were boys who learned early that waiting for rescue was a losing strategy. Who figured out, often before they were teenagers, that the most reliable variable in any situation was themselves. Who developed an internal orientation, a habit of looking inward for resource rather than outward for permission, that became so practiced it eventually became invisible. Just the way they moved through the world. You probably know this type of man. You may be this type of man. He's the one who shows up. Not because he was asked, and not because he needs the credit. But because showing up is simply what the situation requires, and he understood that before anyone had to explain it. He's the one who fixes things, not just physical things, though often those too, but situations. Problems. The particular kind of mess that forms when nobody has been paying attention and suddenly everyone needs it resolved. He doesn't make a production of it. That's the tell. And here's what's interesting about what happens to this man as he gets older. The traits that defined him at 30, the self-containment, the competence, the preference for action over conversation, the ability to be alone without falling apart, those traits don't diminish with age. They compound. Like interest. Every decade of practiced self-reliance makes the next decade easier to navigate. Every time he absorbed difficulty without collapsing, he expanded the range of what he could absorb. Every time he found his own way through something, a job loss, a relationship ending, a health scare handled quietly and without drama, he added another layer to a psychological foundation that most people spend their entire lives trying to build from scratch. By 50, this foundation is substantial. By 60, it is something else entirely. And the men who have built it often don't fully realize what they have. Because they built it the same way they built everything else. Gradually, practically, without ceremony. It didn't feel like growth. It felt like Tuesday. But here's where it gets complicated. Because the same generation that built this psychological resilience also absorbed a particular cultural story about what aging is supposed to look like. And that story, borrowed largely from the boomer experience, amplified by media, repeated until it felt like biology, has almost nothing to do with who these men actually are. The midlife crisis narrative assumes that a man at 50 is fundamentally unsatisfied. That the life he built is somehow insufficient. That he will look back at his younger self with longing and forward at his older self with dread. That the natural response to aging is panic and reinvention. For a lot of Gen X men, that narrative lands like a description of someone they've never met. They look around at the crisis and think, quietly, without saying it, that's not me. And they're right. But they usually don't know why. The psychology of why these men age differently starts with a concept that doesn't get nearly enough attention outside of academic circles. It's called ego resilience. Not ego in the popular sense, not arrogance, not self-importance. Ego in the developmental psychology sense. The capacity of the self to adapt flexibly to new circumstances without losing its essential shape. To bend without breaking. To absorb pressure, change, loss, and uncertainty. And return, not to exactly what it was before, but to something coherent. Something recognizably itself. Psychologist Jack Block, who spent decades studying personality development at Berkeley, identified ego resilience as one of the most significant predictors of how well a person navigates the second half of life. And what his research found was counterintuitive in the best way. Ego resilience doesn't come from having an easy life. It comes from having navigated a difficult one. And having developed, through that navigation, a flexible and durable relationship, which is a clinical way of saying something these men already know in their bones. The hard years made them better at being alive. Not in the motivational poster sense. Not, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, reduced to a bumper sticker. But in the specific, measurable sense that the men who developed self-reliance early, who learned to process difficulty internally, who built competence through repeated exposure to problems that had to be solved. Those men arrive at midlife with an ego structure that is genuinely more resilient than the average. They have, in a very real sense, already done the work. Not the therapeutic work, necessarily. Not the journaling and the processing and the naming of feelings in group settings. But the foundational work. The unglamorous, unrewarded, largely invisible work of becoming someone who can handle their own life. And that changes how aging feels. Because most of what people find terrifying about getting older is uncertainty. The loss of control. The body changing in ways that can't be managed. The career shifting. The relationships transforming. The future becoming less legible. The sense that the map you've been using no longer matches the territory. For most people, that uncertainty triggers something close to existential panic. For men who have been living with uncertainty as a baseline condition since childhood. This is the first hidden advantage. A relationship with uncertainty that was forged early enough that it never calcified into fear. But here's where it gets complicated. Because ego resilience is not the same as emotional health. And the men who developed it through difficult circumstances sometimes built something alongside it, a habit of minimizing, of dismissing internal experience as irrelevant, of treating the self with the same brisk efficiency they applied to everything else. Get through it. Move on. Don't dwell. That worked. For a long time, it worked extremely well. But at 50, at 55, at 60, the things that get minimized start to accumulate weight. The losses that were filed away efficiently rather than fully grieved. The relationships that were maintained practically rather than deeply. The versions of the self that got quietly set aside because there was always something more pressing to attend to. And a man can find himself, at this stage of life, sitting in a house that is exactly what he built, solid, functional, exactly as intended, and feeling a low, sourceless sense that something is slightly incomplete. Not crisis. Not collapse. Just a quiet question, arriving on a Saturday morning, that he doesn't quite have the language for yet. That question isn't a problem. It's a door. And the men who walk through it. Who bring the same patient, practical intelligence they applied to everything else and turn it, finally, toward the interior, those men discover something that genuinely surprises them. There's a body of research that quietly contradicts almost everything the culture tells us about men and aging. In 2019, a longitudinal study published in the journal Psychological Science tracked the emotional lives of men across 5 decades. What it found upended the standard narrative in a way that barely made the news, because good news about men aging well doesn't generate the same cultural traction as crisis. The finding was this. Emotional stability in men increases significantly with age. Not gradually. Significantly. And the increase was most pronounced in men who had developed strong internal regulation strategies earlier in life, men who had learned, by necessity or temperament, to process experience privately before externalizing it. In other words, the men who were called closed off at 30 were, by 55, demonstrably more emotionally stable than their more expressive peers. The thing that looked like a limitation turned out to be a training program. Think about what that means practically. Every time this man absorbed difficulty without dramatizing it, he was building capacity. Every time he sat with discomfort long enough to understand it rather than immediately reacting to it, he was developing a skill that most people spend enormous amounts of money and time trying to acquire in midlife. He already had it. He just didn't have a name for it. In contemplative traditions, what this research is describing has been understood for centuries. The Stoics called it equanimity. The Buddhist tradition calls it non-reactivity. Modern psychology calls it emotional regulation. But whatever language you put around it, the lived experience is the same. It's the ability to feel something fully without being governed by it. To let difficulty arrive, acknowledge it, and respond, rather than react, from a place of relative stability. For GenXmen who develop this capacity through decades of quiet practice, it becomes, by midlife, something close to effortless. Not because they feel less. The research is clear on that, they feel just as much. But because the gap between feeling and reaction has widened enough that there is actual space in there. Space to think. Space to choose. Space to respond to life as it actually is rather than as the loudest part of the nervous system insists it must be. That space is rare. And it becomes more valuable, not less, as life gets more complex. Because life at 50 and 60 is genuinely more complex. The stakes are higher. The decisions carry more weight. The losses are realer. Parents, peers, versions of the future that quietly close. The body starts requiring negotiation rather than simply performing on demand. The career reaches a point where the question is no longer how to climb but what it was all for. These are not small questions. And the man who has spent 30 years developing a stable, patient relationship with his own inner life is far better equipped to sit with them, without panic, without performance, without needing to resolve them immediately, than someone encountering that kind of depth for the first time at 52. But here's where it gets complicated again. Because stability, taken too far, can become stasis. The same emotional regulation that allows this man to move through difficulty without being destroyed by it can, if he's not careful, become a system for avoiding growth rather than enabling it. A way of staying level that slowly becomes a way of staying still. There's a particular kind of man in his late 50s who has everything apparently in order. The life is functional. The routines are solid. The bills are paid and the relationships are maintained and nothing is visibly wrong. But he stopped being surprised by himself somewhere around 50. He stopped encountering edges. Stopped finding the places where his current self runs out and something new might begin. Not because those edges don't exist, they always exist, but because his system for managing experience became so efficient that it started managing away the things that were supposed to be uncomfortable on purpose. The challenges that were meant to be felt. The questions that were meant to remain open. The parts of life that only reveal themselves when you stop being so competent at getting through them. This is the hidden cost that lives inside the hidden strength. And recognizing it, not as failure, not as damage, but as the natural consequence of a very effective system that occasionally needs recalibrating, is itself a form of the same intelligence that built the system in the first place. The man who built himself through honest self-assessment can rebuild through honest self-assessment. That's not a weakness. That's the whole point. So what does this actually look like in practice? Not in theory. Not in the language of research papers or psychological frameworks. But in the specific, lived texture of a man in his 50s or 60s who is doing this well, who has taken everything the hard years built and is using it, consciously or not, to navigate the second half of life in a way that most people around him can sense but couldn't quite articulate. He looks like the man who retired early. Not because he won financially, but because he figured out 20 years ago exactly how much he needed and built toward that number with quiet precision while everyone else was expanding their lifestyle to match their income. Nobody told him to do that. He just did the math, trusted the result, and ignored the noise. He looks like the man who went through a serious health scare at 54 and handled it in a way that confused the people around him. Not by pretending it wasn't happening, but by gathering the information, making the decisions, doing what needed to be done, and then continuing. Not performing stoicism. Not suppressing fear. Just refusing to let the fear run the operation. He looks like the man who, somewhere in his late 50s, quietly stopped doing things he didn't want to do. Not dramatically. Not with a speech or a crisis. He just stopped. Stopped attending the events that cost him more than they gave. Stopped maintaining relationships that only moved in one direction. Stopped performing versions of himself that had always been slightly inaccurate. And in the space that opened up, something interesting happened. He became more himself than he had been since he was young. This is what Erik Erikson called ego integrity, the developmental task of later life, in which a person reviews the arc of their experience and arrives at a fundamental sense of acceptance. Not satisfaction with everything. Not the absence of regret. But a coherent relationship with the life that was actually lived, as opposed to the one that was imagined or expected or demanded. Erikson believed that this was the central psychological work of the second half of life. And he believed that the men and women who did it well arrived at something he called wisdom, not intelligence, not knowledge, but a specific orientation toward existence that only becomes available after enough of it has been lived. What's interesting about GenXMen in this context is that many of them are arriving at ego integrity earlier than the developmental timeline would predict. Not because they're rushing it, but because they already did so much of the foundational work. The self-reliance was already built. They sit down with them the way they sit down with any complex problem. Patiently. Without drama. With the specific confidence of someone who has figured things out before and expects, reasonably, to figure this out too. That patience is not passivity. It is one of the most active and demanding psychological stances a human being can maintain. And it produces something in these men that becomes visible to the people around them, though often without being named, as a quality of presence. A groundedness. The sense that this particular person is not going to be blown over by whatever arrives next. Not because he is rigid, but because he is rooted. People are drawn to that. Not always consciously. But they find themselves, in difficult moments, gravitating toward this man. Calling him when things go wrong. Sitting near him at gatherings without quite knowing why. Trusting his assessment of situations before he has said a word. He has become, without announcing it, a kind of anchor. Not a leader in the performed, title-carrying sense. Something older than that. Something closer to what every human community has always needed and rarely been able to name, the man who has been through enough that his presence alone communicates something essential. It's going to be okay. Not because he says so, but because he is standing there, unhurried and unfrightened, and that fact alone changes the temperature of the room. But here's where it gets complicated one final time. Because this quality, this groundedness, this earned presence, is invisible to the culture that most of these men grew up in. It doesn't register on the metrics that get rewarded. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't trend. It accumulates no followers and generates no content and cannot be monetized or optimized or turned into a personal brand. In a world organized around visibility, the most valuable thing this man has built is almost entirely invisible. And some of these men, the honest ones, will admit, quietly, that it sometimes feels like it doesn't count. That the depth was real but the recognition never came. That they did the work, absorbed the difficulty, built the foundation. And the world kept looking somewhere else. That feeling is real. And it deserves more than dismissal. Here is what needs to be said about that feeling. The absence of recognition is not the same as the absence of value. These are two completely different things that our culture has spent decades conflating, and the men who absorb that conflation most deeply are often the ones who built the fuel of being known. Not celebrated. Not praised. Just, accurately seen. By someone who understands what it costs to become this. Who recognizes the discipline inside the routine, the tenderness inside the self-containment, the rich and patient interior life inside the man who never made much noise about having one. That recognition, when it arrives, lands differently for men like this. It doesn't produce gratitude exactly. It produces something quieter and more fundamental. A kind of settling. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying something a long way and has finally, in a particular moment, been allowed to set it down, not permanently, not forever, but just long enough to feel the weight of it. To acknowledge that it was heavy. That carrying it required something real. That is what this video is, in the end. Not analysis. Not a psychological framework. Not a self-help prescription for men who were never going to follow one anyway. Just a moment of accurate seeing. And if you are the man this video has been describing, if you recognized yourself in the early morning kitchen, in the quiet competence, in the way you move through difficulty without making it a production, then there are a few things worth taking forward from here. The first is this: what you built is real. The psychological foundation, the earned stability, the capacity to be present and unfrightened in situations that destabilize others. That is not nothing. That is not the consolation prize for a life lived outside the spotlight. That is the thing itself. The actual substance of a life well navigated. The second is this, the door that opened in those quiet Saturday morning moments, the one that felt like an incomplete question you didn't quite have language for, that door is worth walking through. Not because something is wrong, but because the same intelligence you applied to everything external is capable, finally, of being turned inward without threat. You have enough foundation now to look at the whole of the thing. To sit with the parts that were set aside. To allow the version of yourself that was protected by competence to come forward into a life that is now, finally, stable enough to hold it. That is not weakness. That is the last form of the same courage that built everything else. And the third, the one that is perhaps the most quietly urgent, is this, the men around you who are like you are often as unseen as you have been. The ones who show up, who carry things, who handle what needs handling without requiring an audience. They are running on the same depleted fuel. And they will not ask. But they will notice. They will notice if you name something true in their presence. If you sit with them in a difficulty without immediately trying to fix it. If you allow a conversation to go somewhere real without redirecting it toward the practical. These men are not looking for therapy. They are looking for a moment of being known, the same thing you have been looking for. And they will find it in the same place you found it. In another person who has been through enough to understand without needing it explained. That is community, for men like this. Not organized. Not scheduled. Not performed. Just two people in a room who have both been carrying something a long way, who recognize each other without a word, and who sit for a moment in the particular peace of not having to pretend that the carrying was easy. There's an old Japanese concept called Shibui, a form of beauty that only becomes visible with age. Not the bright, immediate beauty of youth. But something slower. Deeper. The beauty of the thing that has been used, and weathered, and worn into its truest shape by years of honest contact with the world. A river stone. A wooden handle polished by 10,000 mornings. A face that has stopped trying to be anything other than exactly what it is. That is what this kind of aging looks like from the outside, if you know how to look. Not diminishment. Not the slow subtraction of what was once vivid and vital. But the gradual, patient emergence of something that was always underneath. Something that needed time and pressure and the specific friction of a life fully lived to come fully to the surface. The culture missed it. It was too busy looking at the noise. But you were always here. Quiet, and deep, and exactly enough.